Before we wander into the world of stories and memories, let your thoughts slow down for a moment. Get comfortable. Let the quiet settle around you. Tonight, we're going to drift back to the very beginning of Pokémon, back to a time before the games existed, before any region had a name, and long before we ever met a Pikachu or stepped foot in Pallet Town. This story begins with a simple idea and a simple cable. In the early 90s, Satoshi Tajiri had been fascinated with the link cable that connected two Game Boys together. He didn't know what the cable should be used for, only that he felt a sense of wonder imagining little creatures traveling back and forth along that wire, as if the cable were a bridge between two tiny ecosystems. That image sparked something, a spark that eventually became the entire Pokémon universe. Game Freak, the small company Tajiri co-founded, was still learning how to build console games. They didn't have much money, and developing for the Game Boy meant working under very tight limits. Tiny cartridges, tiny screens, and equally tiny amounts of memory to store ideas. Yet somehow, the very first Pokémon games slowly took shape inside those boundaries. Originally, the project wasn't called Pokémon at all. It carried an earlier name, Capsule Monsters, inspired by small toy vending machines in Japan that dispensed little collectible figures inside plastic capsules. The idea was simple: mysterious creatures you could discover and exchange. A world that felt alive, even inside an 8-bit handheld. As development continued, Capsule Monsters evolved, much like the creatures inside it eventually would. The name shortened, the concept matured, and the world began to form. Towns, routes, forests, and caves were shaped one by one. To keep things organized, those early towns were named after colors, shades that helped the team visualize Kanto as a simple, unified palette. And yet, because memory was so limited, everything had to be reused or recycled. Even the Pokémon cries, those charming, scratchy sound effects, couldn't all be unique. Several creatures shared the same raw audio base, adjusted only slightly to create variation. It wasn't a stylistic choice. It was survival. Every bite mattered. When you trace the origins of Pokémon back to this era, you begin to see how carefully the world was stitched together, one limitation at a time. And somehow, those limitations created a kind of quiet magic. The first Pokémon games weren't born from enormous budgets or endless resources. They were born from imagination and a deep love for the tiny worlds hidden inside the minds of players. And from that foundation, from a link cable, from a memory-starved handheld console, from a small group of passionate creators, the journey truly began. Now that we've set the stage, we can gently step deeper into the history of these early creatures and the ideas that shaped them. As the early foundations of the Pokémon world settled into place, the designers began shaping the creatures who would inhabit it. But the Pokémon we know today weren't built all at once, and many of the earliest designs looked surprisingly different from their final forms. One of the earliest creatures ever drawn for the series wasn't Pikachu, and it wasn't any of the starters either. It was Clefairy. In the beginning, Clefairy was more than just another Pokémon. It was a candidate for the role of the franchise mascot. Before Pikachu won that spot, Clefairy appeared in test illustrations, early manga, and even some of Game Freak's internal documents. Its round shape and gentle personality felt like a perfect fit for children. The team even created rough sketches of Clefairy walking beside the player character, testing how it would look in promotional materials. Even the name Pokémon wasn't settled yet. Capsule Monsters slowly shifted into Pocket Monsters, and from there into the shorter name we all know, These early names weren't just branding. They reflected the simple wonder the developers wanted players to feel. Tiny creatures tucked away in your pocket, each one with its own life and personality. But while the ideas were dreamy, the hardware was not. Memory limitations were strict, painfully strict. Every Pokémon needed a front sprite, a back sprite, cries, stats, animations, move lists, Pokédex data. And the Game Boy's tiny cartridge didn't leave much room for creativity. Because of that, a surprising number of Pokémon shared sound files. Some cries were identical except for pitch changes. Others were built from the same recycled tone, stretched or compressed to sound unique enough. What we often imagine as deliberate stylistic choices were actually workarounds, clever shortcuts to avoid exceeding the storage limits. Even the town names were chosen with memory in mind. In early development, Kanto's locations were simply labeled with colors, a palette of soft tones that helped the team keep track of the map. Cerulean was Blue Town, Vermilion was Red Town, Lavender, Purple Town. These color-themed names weren't placeholders. They reflected how the team visualized Kanto as a world connected by mood and gentle tonal shifts. Everything felt like it belonged on the same canvas. And then, among all the technical challenges, new ideas began to shape the creature designs themselves. Something as simple as the Game Boy's portrait ratio influenced the way Pokémon sprites were drawn. Wide creatures had to be reimagined to fit neatly inside a small square space. Dragons were redesigned. Serpents were curled into tight shapes so they wouldn't overflow from the battle screen. Constraints shaped creativity at every turn. You can almost picture the developers sitting around a cluttered desk late at night, adjusting pixel art one line at a time, stretching tails upward, curling wings inward, making every sprite feel expressive without exceeding the tiny box it lived in. These early decisions, shaped by limited screens, hard memory caps, and the simplest tools, gave us the distinctive charm we still feel today when we look at those old black and white sprites. Nothing about early Pokémon development was perfect or polished, but that imperfection created something gentle, warm, and strangely timeless. The world of Pokémon wasn't born fully formed. It grew slowly, shaped by limitations and endless imagination. And as we move deeper into the story, we'll see just how many unexpected choices and surprising shortcuts built the foundation of this legendary series. As the Pokémon world took shape, the developers began fine-tuning how the game would feel to play, not just in its visuals, but in its systems, its balance, and its small hidden mechanics. Generation 1 is remembered for its charm, but underneath that charm lives a framework built from hundreds of tiny decisions, some logical, some experimental, and some so unusual that they became legendary quirks in their own right. Tonight, we drift into those quiet mechanics, the surprising, often invisible rules that shaped the way early Pokémon behaved. The secret behind critical hits. In modern Pokémon, critical hits feel random, sudden bursts of power that come from luck. But in Generation 1, critical hits weren't based on luck at all. They were based on speed. The faster a Pokémon was, the more likely it was to land a critical hit. This meant that certain Pokémon, even small or fragile ones, could hit with surprising strength simply because of how fast they were coded. A quick Pokémon wasn't just nimble, it was unusually dangerous. This single mechanic caused battles to feel unpredictable, almost chaotic at times. A frail Pokémon could sometimes strike with a force that felt far beyond its stats, simply because of how the formula calculated critical hits. It was one of many quirks born not from design philosophy, but from technical experimentation. The developers were exploring a new genre, trying new ideas and discovering the consequences only after implementing them. Inspiration. Hidden inside fossils. Some of the earliest Pokémon designs weren't inspired by fantasy creatures or childhood imagination. They were inspired by museum fossils. The origin of Kabuto and Omanite can be traced back to visits the creators made to natural history exhibits. They were fascinated by prehistoric shells, ancient marine life, and the idea of reviving extinct species. That inspiration eventually grew into one of the most beloved features in Pokémon, discovering a fossil early in the adventure, carrying it for half the game, and finally resurrecting it into a living creature. This idea, reviving the past, fit perfectly with the themes of exploration and discovery the developers wanted players to feel. The fossil Pokémon weren't placed randomly. They were designed to evoke a sense of history within a world that already felt mysterious. The rival was never meant to be kind. As the game's mechanics were solidifying, the developers began shaping the personalities of the human characters, especially the rival. Your childhood rival was written to be confident, slightly rude, always one step ahead of you, and just a bit arrogant, not because they wanted a villain, but because the rival needed to push the player forward. This character was based loosely on personalities found in manga of the era: competitive, slightly bratty boys who existed to motivate the main character without ever becoming outright enemies. In the earliest notes, the rival was meant to feel like an obstacle you could overcome, someone who challenged you at every step, forcing you to grow alongside your Pokémon. It created emotional texture in a world that might otherwise feel quiet. A shiny that everyone was meant to find. Shiny Pokémon didn't exist yet in Generation 1. The concept wouldn't appear until Gold and Silver. But the idea of a special version of a Pokémon was already being explored behind the scenes. This eventually led to the creation of one of the most iconic moments in all of Pokémon: the encounter with the red Gyarados in the Lake of Rage. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate design choice. The developers wanted every player, even those with no knowledge of shiny odds or hidden mechanics, to experience the joy of encountering a rare version of a familiar creature. The red Gyarados was designed to create a moment of shared wonder, a visual surprise that didn't require any explanation. That tradition of rare encounters began with simple intent: to make players feel like the world held secrets waiting to be uncovered. The anime helped shape the franchise. As the game's systems came together, Pokémon's anime adaptation began development alongside it. Each medium influenced the other in subtle ways. The anime turned ordinary creatures into cultural legends. Moves like Thunderbolt and Flamethrower became recognizable by name. Characters like Ash, Misty, and Brock created emotional connections that the game alone couldn't. The anime wasn't just marketing. It was part of the story of Pokémon becoming a global phenomenon. It softened the world, made it brighter, more accessible, and it helped shape the way the world perceived Pokémon not as data or code, but as living companions, each with their own hearts and personalities. Generation 1's mechanics were imperfect. Some were accidental. Some were unbalanced. Some would never return in future generations. But each one contributed to the strange, nostalgic charm that defines the early games, a charm that continues to feel warm and familiar decades later. These mechanics, quirks, and early design choices created a sense of unpredictability that made the world feel alive, even inside the limitations of an 8-bit handheld console. Now, with those hidden systems in mind, we can gently drift deeper into the development history that shaped the Kanto we know today. As the world of Pokémon continued to take shape, the developers began refining the internal structure that held everything together. Behind the familiar towns and routes, behind the sprites and battles, the early games relied on an invisible framework, an internal skeleton made up of numbers, data slots, and early design placeholders. This framework quietly reveals what the developers built first, what they changed, and what they left behind. And it begins with something surprising. The very first Pokémon in the internal data, the one that occupies slot numero 1, is not Bulbasaur. It's Raiden. Not because Raiden was meant to be a starter, not because it was a mascot, but because it was the first test subject, the creature used to make sure the game engine actually worked. Raiden was simple, sturdy, and humanoid enough to test movement, animations, collision, hit detection, and battle mechanics. It was a model creature, a reliable test shape, and because it was programmed before everything else, it naturally claimed the very first index position. If you look closely at Kanto, you can still see echoes of this early role. The statues inside gyms and buildings, those large stone figures beside the doors, are actually Raiden models, repurposed to serve as decorative art. In a quiet way, Raiden became the foundation of the world, a piece of early testing that never quite disappeared. A rival. You could name yourself. The rival in Red and Blue was always meant to follow the player closely, appearing at key moments to challenge and motivate them. But Game Freak wanted players to have a sense of ownership over that relationship, which is why you were allowed to name him. At first, the rival's name was coded as a simple text entry, nothing more. But as development progressed, the team realized how personal that choice could feel. So they added default name suggestions that reflected the personality they had in mind. Short, sharp, energetic names like Blue or Gary. Names that made the rival feel familiar, even before you picked one. In a small but meaningful way, the developers wanted you to feel like this character had always known you, even though you were creating the connection yourself. Hidden details. Inside the Safari Zone. The Safari Zone was one of the most experimental areas in the early game. It used entirely different mechanics from standard encounters, new rules, special tools, and unpredictable capture rates. Because of the complexity, it took much longer to develop than other parts of the map. The design relied heavily on limited steps, bait, rocks, unique fleeing behavior, a self-contained item system. In early builds, the Safari Zone was even more elaborate, with additional rooms and unused mechanics that never made it to the final version. But even after it was simplified, the area kept its mysterious charm. A place where the usual rules didn't apply, and where Pokémon behaved differently from anywhere else in Kanto. It remains one of the earliest examples of Game Freak pushing the boundaries of the Game Boy to create something that felt alive and unpredictable. Your mom's role in the game one of the tiny but charming decisions in the original games was the fact that the player's mother had, at least at first, no major role. But the developers added a small detail to give her relevance. Your mother stays behind and supports you, offering a quiet place to rest at any time. Later generations expanded this idea, giving mothers a slightly larger part in your journey. But in Generation 1, she was simply a warm reminder of home, a quiet anchor, a way to make the world feel grounding and familiar in a game full of new creatures and dangers. The emotional simplicity of it is easy to overlook, but it helped the world feel real, even on a tiny monochrome screen. Nurse Joy, a symbol of consistency. As towns developed, Game Freak needed a way to help players recognize safe places instantly. The solution became one of the most iconic and comforting constants in the entire franchise: Nurse Joy. Every Pokémon Center featured the same gentle character, the same soft posture, the same lines of dialogue, and even the same minimal animation. This wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a conscious design strategy. The team wanted players, especially young children, to feel immediate comfort and familiarity the moment they walked into a Pokémon Center. Even the color palette and gentle music were built to reinforce calmness. Over time, Nurse Joy became a symbol of rest in a world filled with challenges, a place where nothing could hurt you and where every journey could safely begin again. In these small, often unseen decisions, from Raiden as the very first Pokémon in the code, to the consistency of Nurse Joy, to the strange mechanics of the Safari Zone, we glimpse the quieter side of early Pokémon development. A world built piece by piece, one hidden detail at a time, shaped by limitations but guided by creativity. And with each decision, Kanto slowly became the magical place we remember. As Pokémon's world grew more detailed, the developers began fine-tuning the way moves worked, the accuracy, the power, the surprising quirks hidden beneath the surface. These systems were quietly complex, held together by formulas that weren't visible to players, yet shaped almost every battle. Tonight, we drift gently into those hidden mechanics, the ones that quietly determined how each move felt inside the world of Generation 1. Accuracy that didn't always make sense. In modern Pokémon, accuracy is straightforward. If a move says it hits 100% of the time, it hits. But in the earliest games, accuracy behaved a little differently. Even moves that were meant to be perfectly reliable could still miss, because the game always included a tiny chance of failure, almost like a breath of randomness in the code. Sometimes it felt like the game had a personality of its own, a small reminder that battles weren't meant to be predictable. On the opposite end, certain moves with low accuracy could sometimes land more often than expected because of hidden rounding rules in the code. It made attacks feel slightly mysterious, as if the game were bending probability in subtle ways. To players, these quirks didn't feel like glitches. They felt like the natural unpredictability of the world. The bicycle was more than just a shortcut. One of the simplest items in the game ended up becoming an unexpected symbol of freedom: the bike. Movement was slow on foot, partly because the developers wanted the world to feel larger, and partly because the Game Boy hardware could only process movement in small increments. But once you climbed onto the bicycle, the world opened up. Routes felt wider. Long stretches of road flowed beneath your character more smoothly. It was one of the earliest moments in Pokémon that gave players a sense of speed, of rhythm, of movement. The bicycle wasn't just a convenience. It was a quiet moment where the game invited you to breathe, explore, and enjoy the journey. And for a generation of players, the song that played while biking became one of the most nostalgic sounds in all of gaming. The legendary birds were designed as a balanced trio. Before designs like the Regis or the Tapus or the Swords of Justice existed, Kanto introduced the world to its first legendary trio: Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres. These three weren't chosen randomly. They were built around a simple, elegant pattern: Articuno, the first in the index; Zapdos, the second with a name suggesting electricity; Moltres, the third, with tres, meaning three, in Spanish. Each bird mirrored its elemental theme through its posture, feathers, and color. Each had its own region in the map, its own unique environment, and its own feeling. Even their cries were meant to feel like powerful versions of standard bird Pokémon, echoes of their elemental identity carried through the Game Boy speaker. For many players, encountering these birds was their first experience with legendary creatures, beings who felt ancient, powerful, and mysterious, even without elaborate lore. The Kanto map was quietly modeled after the real world. Many people imagine Kanto as a purely fictional place, a map drawn from fantasy alone. But the developers were inspired by a very real location while designing it, the region around Tokyo. You can sense the influence when you compare them. Celadon City resembles a compressed version of central Tokyo. Pallet Town mirrors the quiet suburbs. Saffron echoes the heart of the city. Lavender Town aligns with older, more rural areas. This structure wasn't meant to be perfect or geographically accurate. It was more of a feeling, an emotional echo of the places the creators grew up in, blended with the imaginative world they wanted players to explore. They weren't just building a map. They were building a memory. Many Pokémon cries were performed by human voices. One of the most surprising details from early Pokémon animation is that the cries we grew up hearing in the anime weren't created by synthesizers or digital filters. Many of them were performed by voice actors. Voice artists didn't simply mimic animal sounds. They created distinct personalities for each Pokémon using tone, rhythm, and emotion. Sometimes they layered multiple voices together. Sometimes they pitched them up or down. And sometimes they kept the raw performance almost untouched. This gave Pokémon a warm, human quality that felt unique compared to other animated series of the era. It helped turn simple creatures into emotional companions. And for many fans, those cries are now some of the most iconic sounds of their childhood. Metronome, a move, built on pure imagination. Few moves feel as whimsical and unpredictable as Metronome, the move that can call forth nearly any technique in the game. Its origin was simple. The developers wanted a move that embodied chaos, a move that symbolized possibility, randomness, and creativity. Metronome was designed to be fun, to break tension, to surprise both players and developers alike. And because Generation 1's move data was structured in long lists, Metronome could trigger almost anything, even moves that weren't supposed to appear in normal battles. Its unpredictability wasn't just a gimmick. It was a window into the developer's playful side. These early mechanics, maps, and sounds created the emotional texture of Kanto, a world where rules were flexible, surprises were hidden in the smallest details, and nothing ever felt too perfect or too polished. It was a world built from experimentation, limitation, and imagination. And somehow, all those ingredients blended into a universe that millions of people still carry in their hearts. With these hidden mechanics behind us, we can move deeper into the atmosphere, evolution, and mysteries that shaped Generation 1 into something unforgettable. As Kanto's world grew more complete, the developers began refining the moments that connected players to each other, the trades, the gym challenges, and all the little interactions that helped the world feel alive and shared. These parts of the game weren't just mechanics, they were experiences woven gently into the journey, moments that made the world feel larger than the screen it lived in. Tonight, we drift into those connective details, the quiet systems and design decisions that shaped how players met, battled, explored, and traded in Generation 1. The magic of trading, a link between worlds. In the early days of Pokémon, trading wasn't just a mechanic. It was the heart of the entire experience. The Game Boy Link cable, that simple cord connecting two handhelds, became a kind of doorway. The bridge Tajiri had imagined years earlier when Pokémon was still just an idea. When two players brought their Game Boys together, the game displayed a simple but magical animation. Pokeballs sliding back and forth, gently crossing the screen. Inside those animations, the developers saw something special. Not just data being transferred, but the emotional moment of giving and receiving, a ritual between friends. Of course, in the early builds, trading was not entirely safe. There were glitches, risks, and moments where a Pokémon could vanish if the transfer failed midway. Losing a beloved creature felt heartbreaking, but those risks made the process feel real, like letting go of something and trusting that it would arrive safely on the other side. Even decades later, that simple exchange animation remains one of the most iconic memories from Generation 1. A gentle reminder that the Pokémon universe was always meant to be shared. Gym puzzles, more than just obstacles. Each gym was designed not only as a battle challenge, but as a small puzzle, a way to make each location feel unique. Lotine Surge's gym used electric barriers and switches. Erica's gym hid trainers among flowers and hedges. Sabrina's gym played with teleportation patterns. And Koga's gym was built with invisible walls, a trick that confused countless players. These puzzles weren't meant to be difficult, just distinctive. They turned each gym into a small story, a moment where the player wasn't just fighting stronger opponents, but learning something about each gym leader's personality and style. Those little design touches made Kanto feel more like a living world and less like a sequence of battles. Metronome's wild beginnings. The move metronome deserves a moment of quiet appreciation. In Generation 1, the developers wanted at least one move that felt like pure possibility, a move that embodied the spirit of randomness and imagination. Metronome became that answer. The move could call forth almost any attack in the game, even ones you weren't meant to see through normal play. Sometimes powerful, sometimes silly, always surprising. Players would gather around and laugh when a tiny Pokémon used metronome and unleashed a massive move like Hydro Pump or Earthquake. Moments like that made battles feel alive, as if the game itself had a playful personality. Bike and running. The joy of speed. Before later games introduced running as a built-in movement, Generation 1 relied entirely on the bicycle to make travel faster. Getting the bike wasn't just an upgrade, it was a moment of freedom. The world suddenly felt wide, full of wind and motion. Routes that once felt long suddenly seemed open and breezy. There was something soothing about riding the bike through long routes, hearing that cheerful melody loop again and again, while wild Pokémon rustled softly in the grass. Even today, many players remember the bike theme as one of the happiest sounds of the early series. Early trade risks a bit of fragile magic. In its earliest state, the trading system wasn't fully stable. If players disconnected the link cable at the wrong moment, or if a Game Boy battery died mid-transfer, the Pokémon being traded could be lost forever, gone, trapped in broken data. It was a fragile magic, beautiful but delicate. And because Pokémon were deeply personal, losing one created real emotion. This fragility made trading feel surprisingly real. You weren't just exchanging numbers in a machine. You were giving away something precious, trusting that it would survive the journey. That emotional weight wasn't intentional, but it shaped the memories of an entire generation. Gym leaders were designed to teach without words. Each gym wasn't just a battle. It was a lesson. A moment where the developers used opponents to teach the player how to think, strategize, and adapt. For example, Brock teaches type advantage. Misty teaches status and speed. Lit Surge teaches paralyzing moves and punishing mistakes. Erica teaches resistances and sleep mechanics. Sabrina introduces high-speed glass cannons. Koga tests patience with poison. Blaine forces cautious play. Giovanni caps everything with raw power and strategy. These lessons weren't spelled out in dialogue. They were embedded in the battles themselves, a silent way of teaching through experience. It's a subtle reminder of how much thought went into shaping the player's journey. Kanto's layout encouraged exploration. Even though the region was compact, it was built with looping paths, short detours, and areas you revisited later with new items, a clever strategy to make the world feel larger. Cut trees blocked optional routes. Boulders hinted at strength-based puzzles yet to come. Snorlax guarded major pathways. Surfing opened up hidden corners of the map. Kanto wasn't just a place you traveled through. It was a place you returned to, again and again, seeing it with new eyes each time. This design philosophy made the world feel alive, as if it were waiting for you to grow before it revealed its secrets. These systems, trading, gym puzzles, metronome, movement speed, subtle map design, were all small threads woven into the larger tapestry of Generation 1. Individually, they may seem simple, but together, they created a world that was warm, playful, and endlessly explorable. A world where friends gathered to trade, where gym leaders taught lessons without saying a word, and where every mechanic felt like a small adventure. With these gentle memories in mind, we can drift even deeper into the origins of evolution, items, and the mysterious atmosphere surrounding places like Lavender Town. As you continue to drift deeper into Kanto's history, the world begins to reveal its quieter layers, the symbolism behind evolution stones, the origins of breeding mechanics, and the lingering shadows that gave Lavender Town its unforgettable atmosphere. These ideas were shaped long before players ever discovered them. Some grew from cultural traditions, some from the developers' personal experiences, some simply from the limitations of the Game Boy. Tonight, let's wander through these deeper meanings, the ones tucked into the corners of the early games. The quiet symbolism behind evolution. Stone's evolution stones were more than just magical items. They were designed to reflect specific emotional and thematic ideas, subtle symbolic touches that helped shape each Pokemon's identity. For example, the Fire Stone represents passion, change, and sudden transformation, a flash of heat that reshapes a creature instantly. The Water Stone symbolizes fluid growth, like the flow of a river, carving new paths through the world. The Thunderstone captures the idea of sudden revelation, power arriving in an instant, like a bolt from the sky. The Leaf Stone echoes nature's gentle cycles of growth and renewal. These weren't accidental correlations. The developers reflected on folklore, traditional Japanese symbolism, and the emotional resonance behind each element. They wanted evolution stones to feel ancient, like mysterious artifacts discovered long before your journey began. When a Pokémon touches one, it isn't just changing its form. It's accepting a piece of the world's energy, becoming something new through the power of nature itself. The origins of Pokémon breeding. In Generation 1, breeding didn't exist, but the idea already lived quietly within the minds of the developers. They imagined a world where Pokémon, like real animals, had life cycles, where they paired naturally, where offspring inherited traits from parents. When breeding eventually arrived in Generation 2, players recognized it as something new. But for the developers, it was the fulfillment of an idea that had been waiting behind the scenes. Breeding was built around gentle symbolism, love, patience, growth, caretaking, and the passing of traits between generations. Even the placement of the daycare center, on a quiet, peaceful path reflects the emotional softness they wanted this mechanic to carry. And in a small but meaningful cycle, baby Pokémon gave families a sense of continuity. It stitched generations together. Lavender Town's quiet mystery. Perhaps no place in Kanto carries more emotional weight than Lavender Town, a quiet, misty location defined by its somber music and themes of loss. Its haunting melody was composed to feel different from every other theme in the game. A slower rhythm, distant tones, and a sense of echoing emptiness. The cemetery tower, the ghost encounters, the haunting fog. These elements were designed to gently introduce players to the idea that Pokémon could pass on, that they were beings with stories, with families, with memories. It's one of the rare moments in the game where the tone shifts fully into something reflective and emotional. Lavender Town wasn't created to be scary. It was created to feel still. A place where the world slowed down long enough for players to sense that Pokémon weren't just companions. They were lives. And although many myths later surrounded the music, the developers intended the town to carry a quiet, respectful sadness, a reminder of connection, not fear. Lavender Town also served a mechanical purpose. It introduced players to new layers of game logic, ghost types, the Sylph scope mechanic, and the idea of hidden identities. Even here, storytelling and gameplay were intertwined. Daycare as a symbol of trust. In Generation 1, you could leave a Pokémon at the daycare. It would grow slowly, gaining experience as time passed. This simple feature carried emotional resonance. You were trusting someone else with something precious. The location of the daycare, on a peaceful route away from busy towns, was chosen intentionally. It felt like a safe place to rest, grow, and wait patiently for your return. The mechanic wasn't just convenient. It introduced the idea of care, of growth happening even when you weren't watching. Later, breeding would expand on that idea. But in these early days, the daycare was a quiet symbol of love. Why these themes matter? Evolution stones, breeding, the daycare, and Lavender Town all reveal something important about Generation 1. The developers weren't just building mechanics, they were building meaning. Every system, even the smallest detail, carried weight. Fire as transformation, water as life, thunder as awakening, leaves as natural growth, daycare as trust, Lavender Town as remembrance. These elements gave Kanto emotional depth far beyond what the hardware could display. Even today, when players hear Lavender Town's melody or see an evolution stone glow, they feel something. Something gentle, nostalgic, and strangely comforting. Because the early games weren't designed as just battles and numbers. They were designed as stories, quiet stories, told through items, locations, and simple moments that stayed with us long after we turned off the Game Boy. As the Kanto region continued to grow, the developers experimented with how Pokémon looked, behaved, evolved, and even sparkled. Generation 1 didn't yet contain shinies or baby Pokémon, but the seeds of those ideas were already drifting quietly in the background, waiting for future games to bring them to life. Tonight, we drift into the gentle beginnings of these concepts, the first sparkles of shinies, the earliest idea threads for baby Pokémon, and the hidden mechanics tucked inside, moves that were far more dramatic than they appeared. Shinies, a concept born from subtlety. Shiny Pokémon wouldn't officially appear until Generation 2, but the thinking behind them can be traced back to the developers' earliest ideas. In those early years, Game Freak wanted certain Pokémon to feel special, not just rare, but visually rare. They wanted a small number of Pokémon to stand out in a way players could recognize instantly. A rare sparkle, a different coloring, something that felt like a natural surprise rather than a scripted event. Of course, the original Game Boy couldn't support alternate sprite palettes, so the idea waited quietly in the background. But the team held onto that spark of inspiration, the wish to create creatures that rewarded curiosity, patience, and a bit of luck. When shinies finally debuted in gold and silver, they represented a concept that had been waiting since Kanto. Small visual miracles hidden in plain sight. Baby Pokémon began as a softening of the world. Even though baby Pokémon officially debuted in Generation 2, the emotional reasoning behind them was already present during Generation 1's development. The idea was simple: to make the world feel more tender. Baby Pokémon were intended to make evolution lines feel natural and connected, represent childhood and growth, reinforce the theme that Pokémon are living creatures, expand the lore of families players already loved. They weren't designed for competitive battles. They were designed for world building, to bring warmth into the world, to soften certain Pokémon families, to give players a sense of caring and nurturing. It was a philosophy that aligned beautifully with Pokémon's core identity. When Gen 2 finally introduced Cleffa, Igglybuff, Pichu, and others, they felt natural, like missing pieces that had always belonged. And they did. Their roots lived quietly in the emotional DNA of Gen 1. Move damage was more complex than it appeared. Many Generation 1 moves, especially explosive or high-risk techniques, had hidden layers beneath their simple descriptions. Self-destruct and explosion were not just powerful because of their base damage. They doubled their attack power before applying defense calculations, a quirk that made them much stronger than expected. This meant that certain Pokémon, especially those with high attack stats, could unleash devastating force in an instant. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't highlighted. It wasn't explained in any manual. It was simply a hidden mechanic, a quiet detail tucked inside the game's early code. These subtleties added depth to battle strategies, even before players fully understood them. Generation 1 was filled with these silent little surprises, mechanics that felt almost like secrets waiting to be uncovered. The move power curve was meant to enrich storytelling. Not all moves were created equal. Some powerful moves were rare because the developers wanted them to feel like discoveries. Techniques like Thunder, Blizzard, Solar Beam, Hyper Beam weren't just numbers on a screen. They represented a sense of progression, moments when your Pokémon felt like it had reached a higher stage of mastery. By contrast, simpler moves like Tackle or Gust created the sense of early struggle, making every improvement feel meaningful. The move curve wasn't just balance, it was narrative. It helped tell the story of growth. Hidden effects existed behind friendly names. Several moves in Generation 1 carried hidden rules not mentioned anywhere, sometimes bugs, sometimes oversights, sometimes deliberate design. For example, some multi-hit moves had slightly boosted accuracy behind the scenes. Certain status conditions lasted longer than intended, and a few moves behaved differently depending on which Pokémon used them. Most players never discovered these details, but they shaped countless battles quietly, giving the early metagame its unpredictable charm. Generation 1 was not perfect, but its imperfections made it feel alive. The first steps toward future mechanics. Even though many of these ideas, shinies, babies, complex move logic, wouldn't fully blossom until later generations, their beginnings lived inside Generation 1 like dormant seeds. The developers were thinking ahead, exploring possibilities that the Game Boy simply couldn't support yet. They imagined a world where Pokémon sparkled, families grew larger, moves behaved more like real techniques, evolution felt emotional rather than mechanical, and every part of the world responded to the player's growth. Generation 1 didn't have the hardware to bring these dreams to life, but it carried their spirit. Every future innovation in Pokémon traces back to these early whispers, small ideas that waited patiently until the technology caught up. As we move deeper, we'll begin exploring wandering legendaries, anime storytelling influences, and the early gym design philosophies that shaped how players understood the world. These details, quiet, thoughtful, emotional, are what made Generation 1 more than a game. They made it an experience. As Kanto's mechanics grew more refined, the developers began weaving in storytelling elements, both subtle and bold, that shaped how players understood the world. Some of these choices appeared in the games themselves, while others emerged through the anime, expanding the region's lore in unexpected directions. Tonight, we drift through the gentle threads of narrative and motion, the way legendary beasts wandered through the map, the quiet backstories given to gym leaders in the anime, and early ideas that never reached the final version of the games. The roaming legendaries, a design meant to feel alive. When Johto introduced its second generation, Game Freak wanted legendaries that felt dynamic, unpredictable creatures that moved freely across the map rather than waiting quietly in caves. This idea led to the creation of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, the first roaming legendaries. Their movement wasn't random. It was meant to mimic the behavior of wild animals, shifting territories, wandering restlessly, escaping danger, eluding human contact. Every time you took a step or changed routes, the beasts adjusted their paths. The game quietly tracked their positions behind the scenes. The developers wanted players to experience the same feeling they had as children exploring forests. That sensation of something rare passing by, a fleeting moment where a magnificent creature might appear or vanish before you had a chance to breathe. Roaming legendaries were meant to feel magical, as if the world itself were alive. Anime backstories, giving gym leaders a heartbeat. While the games introduced gym leaders as strong opponents, the anime expanded them into full characters with stories, emotions, and motivations. For many players, the anime is where figures like Brock, Misty, and Erica truly came alive. The creators wanted gym leaders to feel like mentors, not just obstacles, so they gave them personal struggles, dreams, families, friendships, distinct personalities. Brock became a caretaker figure, responsible for his many siblings. Misty carried insecurities about her place among her sisters. Erica balanced her responsibility as a gym leader with her passion for nature and perfume. These stories weren't artificial additions. They were created to deepen the emotional world of Pokémon. Generation 1's games were limited by memory and couldn't always express the warmth that the team wanted the characters to carry. The anime filled in those emotional spaces, giving players a fuller picture of the Kanto region. Early ideas. Gyms that could be challenged in any order. In the earliest design documents, Game Freak considered allowing gyms to be challenged in a non-linear order, something that only partly survived into the final version. The idea was appealing, a world where exploration came before structure, a region that reacted to the player's path, gym leaders with flexible teams. But the hardware wasn't ready for such complexity. Scaling difficulty, adjusting teams dynamically, and maintaining game balance would have required more memory than the Game Boy could handle. Still, the idea didn't disappear entirely. You can see traces of it in the way Kanto's map is designed. The branching routes, optional paths, the ability to approach certain areas earlier or later, and how Sabrina or Koga could be beaten before the other, depending on your route. The linearity we know today was a compromise. Originally, the world was meant to feel even more open. Those early sketches remain a faint echo behind Kanto's final design, a dream of freedom quietly tucked away in unused notes. The legendary dogs and the influence of emotion Raikou, Entei, and Suicune weren't just mechanical experiments. Each creature carried its own emotional symbolism tied to the events surrounding the burned tower. Their lore reflects tragedy, rebirth, mystery, and the power of nature. This emotional weight was a major reason they were designed to roam. They weren't static beings. They represented natural forces and ancient stories that couldn't be contained in one room. The anime amplified this emotion by giving Suicune in particular a sense of dignity and enigmatic presence, a being that appeared only when the moment felt spiritually significant. It set the tone for future legendary Pokémon, where emotion and lore became inseparable. Storytelling through gameplay, silent narratives. One of the quietest strengths of Generation 1 and 2 is how much they communicated without words. Roaming legendaries conveyed mystery. Gym leader personalities in the anime conveyed heart. The open paths of Kanto conveyed freedom. The ruins and towers of Johto conveyed history. None of these themes were spelled out directly. They were felt. The developers wanted players to absorb the world naturally, to discover meaning through exploration, battle, music, and the silences in between. It's why so many people remember these games not just as adventures, but as feelings. As we drift deeper into the development of Generation 1, we'll explore the cultural roots of ghost lore, the strange quirks of critical hit calculations, and the mechanical systems that shaped early encounters. For now, let the image of those wandering legendary beasts stay with you, moving endlessly through tall grass and quiet plains, free and alive. As we drift a little deeper into the early history of Pokémon, we begin to uncover the quiet cultural influences and mechanical quirks that shaped some of Kanto's most memorable elements. This section takes us into the origins of ghost-type Pokémon, the mysterious cultural traditions that inspired them, and the hidden formulas that made critical hits feel so dramatic in Generation 1. These details weren't always explained directly in the game. They whispered quietly beneath the surface, shaping the world in subtle ways. Tonight, we explore those whispers. Ghost-type Pokémon and their cultural roots. Ghost-type Pokémon weren't born simply as scary creatures. Their origins can be traced back to Japanese folklore, particularly to stories of spirits and wandering souls known as yokai. In these traditional tales, spirits linger in abandoned places. Supernatural beings blur the line between playful and dangerous. Unseen forces move between the world of the living and the world of memory. The developers drew inspiration from these stories when designing Kanto's ghost types, Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar. Even their design progression reflects a traditional supernatural arc. Ghastly, a drifting wisp, a soul without a form. Haunter, gaining shape, mischievous and unpredictable. Gengar, fully materialized, a shadow with weight and intention. Lavender Town and the Pokémon Tower were shaped by this same influence, not to frighten players, but to introduce the idea that the Pokémon world contained spiritual depth, a quiet acknowledgement of life, death, and memory. These themes were presented gently, without heavy explanation, just enough to create a soft echo of mystery that lingered long after players left Lavender Town. Critical hits. a formula hidden in speed. Generation 1's critical hit system was unlike anything that came after it. Today, we think of critical hits as lucky strikes, rare moments when a move lands with more force than usual. But in the earliest games, critical hits weren't just a matter of chance. They were calculated almost entirely from a Pokemon's speed stat. The faster a Pokemon was, the more likely it was to land a devastating blow. This meant that quick, lightweight Pokemon, even those with modest attack power, could sometimes unleash surprising bursts of damage. A Pokemon like Persian, with high speed, could deliver frequent critical hits, making it far more dangerous than its appearance suggested. This design wasn't meant to confuse players. It was simply an early experiment in making speed feel meaningful beyond just turn order. The result was a battle system that felt volatile and organic, a little unpredictable, a little wild, and filled with moments where the unexpected could suddenly turn the tide of a fight. It became one of the quiet charms of Generation 1 battles, adding a layer of tension that made each encounter feel alive. Early attempts at teaching through gameplay. Even in these early mechanical choices, ghost interactions, critical hit formulas, the behavior of types, the developers were already shaping a philosophy. Let players learn through experience, not explanations. Ghost types couldn't be hit by normal or fighting moves. Critical hits came unexpectedly. And certain Pokemon had battle advantages players didn't fully understand at first. These weren't mistakes. They were invitations, moments where the game gently encouraged players to slow down, observe, experiment, and grow. This quiet philosophy can be felt throughout the first generation. A soft, guiding hand, never forceful, but always present. The role of atmosphere in Pokemon's identity. Kanto wasn't built only through mechanics, it was built through mood. Some areas were warm and peaceful, fields of gentle music and light breezes. Others, like Lavender Town or the darker caves, carried an atmosphere of silence and reflection. These contrasts weren't accidents. They were deliberate emotional pacing. Ghosts, spirits, shadows. Their presence enriched the world not through fear, but through depth. By choosing to explore spiritual themes softly, the developers created moments that stayed with players long after the game ended. Even today, the gentle eeriness of Lavender Town, the drifting forms of Haunter and Gengar, and the sudden surprise of critical hits carry a nostalgia that's more soothing than frightening. These moments remind us that Pokémon wasn't just an adventure. It was a world with its own rhythm, its own myths, its own quiet soul. As we drift onward, we'll begin exploring the early technological innovations, the Pokégear, the legendary music themes, and the strange linguistic puzzles behind Unknown, elements that shaped the emotional architecture of Johto and beyond. But before we move forward, let the soft shadows of Kanto's ghost lore settle for a moment, like gentle echoes in a story that continues to whisper long after the lights turn low. As the world of Pokémon continued to grow beyond Kanto, the developers introduced new tools and new layers of atmosphere to help players feel more connected to the journey. Some of these changes were technical innovations, others were artistic evolutions, and some added a quiet sense of mystery that lingered long after players put the Game Boy down. Tonight, we drift into these features. The Pokégear that blended gameplay with real-world influences, the legendary themes shaped by ancient symbolism, and the strange alphabet creatures inspired by puzzles and archaeological curiosity. Each of these elements deepened the world in subtle, gentle ways. The Pokégear, a small device with a big heart. When the second generation arrived, the developers wanted Johto to feel more modern, more alive, and more connected to time itself. This led to the creation of the Pokégear, a device inspired by the real-world rise of mobile phones and compact digital gadgets in the late 90s. The Pokégear wasn't powerful, it wasn't flashy, but it added warmth to the journey in quiet ways. The map helped you understand Johto as a living place. The phone created relationships through calls from trainers and characters. The radio added music that tied areas and moods together. The time system made the world gently follow a day and night rhythm. Through this tiny tool, players felt more connected to the passage of time, as if Johto existed alongside the real world rather than inside the cartridge. It was simple, small, and deeply comforting, like carrying a tiny companion who whispered information gently whenever you needed it. Legendary themes, music shaped by nature's power. The legendary Pokémon of Johto, Raikou, Entei, Suicune, Ho-Oh, and Lugia, were born from concepts rooted in natural forces, traditional mythology, and elemental symbolism. Their musical themes reflected this heritage. Instead of grand orchestral intensity, the composers chose emotional depth. Raikou's theme felt electric and restless. Entei's theme carried the weight of fire and raw instinct. Suicune's theme felt fluid, elegant, almost wind-like. Ho-Oh's music resembled a sacred ritual. Lugia's theme carried the echo of deep oceans and hidden power. These musical choices were deliberate. Melodies meant to capture not just strength, but personality. The developers wanted legendary encounters to feel spiritual, like crossing paths with ancient forces rather than simply battling high-level creatures. These themes helped elevate legendary Pokémon into something more than statistics. They became symbols, living myths. Unknown, a puzzle species, inspired by ancient writing. Then came Unknown, one of the most mysterious and unconventional creatures ever introduced. Unknown were not designed for battle, nor for flashy evolution. They weren't meant to be strong or useful in a traditional way. They were designed as a language. Their shapes mimicked letters of the Latin alphabet, inspired by the idea of ancient civilizations, leaving behind messages carved in stone. The ruins of Alph, their home, were created to feel like an archaeological site. Echoes of lost cultures, hidden puzzles, fragments of unreadable text, a sense of time stretching far into the past. Unknown brought a different kind of storytelling to Pokémon, a story told not through characters or dialogue, but through symbols and atmosphere. Players didn't need to understand everything. The mysteries were meant to linger, like a message written long ago for someone who may never fully interpret it. Unknown weren't there to be understood. They were there to be wondered about. Radio and sound, a world tuned to emotion. The Pokégear's radio wasn't just a mechanical feature. It was designed to shape the emotional tone of the journey. Different channels created a feeling of travel, a sense of mood, a connection to characters, and an atmosphere that shifted gently with each route and location. Game Freak believed sound could influence exploration as much as visuals. They used the radio to make the world feel bigger than the Game Boy screen, a reminder that life continued in the background even when the player wasn't listening. It was a small touch, but it made Johto feel alive, as if its world was humming softly to itself. Weather as a storyteller, Johto also introduced dynamic weather, adding subtle mood changes to the world. Rain softened the landscape. Snow quieted it. Fog created mystery. These environmental shifts were more symbolic than mechanical. They gave players moments where the world felt emotionally in tune with the journey. a gentle reminder that nature had its own rhythm. This was Pokemon's world building at its quietest and most poetic. Together, these innovations, the Pokegear, legendary themes, Unknown, the radio, and weather, created a richer, more emotional world. A world that breathed, a world that listened, a world that felt ancient, modern, mysterious, and comforting all at once. As we continue onward, we'll explore the early weather systems, explosive move mechanics, design inspirations, and the quiet traditions that shaped the Pokémon centers we grew up with. For now, let these memories rest softly, like distant radio static fading into the calm of the night. As Pokémon's world expanded, the developers continued to experiment with the subtle forces that shaped each journey. Weather, terrain, move behavior, and even the smallest environmental details became tools for building emotion, pacing, and surprise. Some of these mechanics were simple, some were complex, and some were little experiments that quietly influenced the atmosphere of the game without most players even realizing it. Tonight, we drift into these understated systems, the earliest weather code, explosive move calculations, and the real-world inspiration behind Pokémon centers. Early weather, a mechanic. Born in shadows. Before weather became a well-known feature in later generations, the developers were already experimenting with it during the early stages of Pokémon's creation. The Game Boy hardware was limited, very limited, but even within those constraints, the team found ways to create misty effects, darkened environments, gentle visual overlays. These early attempts weren't polished, but they helped shape the mood of certain areas. Take fog, for example. In the earliest iterations, fog wasn't an official mechanic, but the developers tested ways to make certain routes or caves look hazy or unclear. This wasn't just for visual flair. It was meant to give players a sense of mystery, a feeling that the world had places where depth and visibility changed, almost like nature itself was breathing. These ideas would later grow into full weather systems in Johto and beyond, but their roots lived quietly in Kanto's code. Explosion and self-destruct. Hidden power. Behind the bang. Some moves in Generation 1 carried secrets deeper than their descriptions. Moves like explosion and self-destruct, which were far more powerful than players realized. On the surface, they were simple. A last resort attack that knocked out the user. But in the code, these moves did something unusual. They halved the opponent's defense stat for the damage calculation. This meant explosion and self-destruct effectively struck with enormous force, stronger than even the highest-powered moves in the game. To a player, it felt like an overwhelming final strike, a dramatic end to a battle, or a desperate moment when everything was on the line. But behind that moment, a hidden formula was quietly amplifying the intensity. It was a small trick, but one that added emotional weight to a move that already felt dramatic. Pokémon centers and capsule hotels, a real-world connection. One charming detail from the early development notes is that Pokémon centers were inspired in part by Japanese capsule hotels, compact, efficient spaces designed to give travelers a place to rest. These hotels are simple, warm, affordable, and designed to help guests recover before continuing their journey. Pokémon centers adopted this essence. A soft soundtrack, a bright, welcoming interior, simple healing services, and an atmosphere of calm and safety. Even Nurse Joy's gentle demeanor mirrored the peaceful, reassuring environment found in real-world capsule inns. It wasn't just about gameplay convenience. It was about creating a moment of relief, a place where you could breathe, reset, and continue your adventure with renewed energy. This emotional foundation is why Pokémon centers remain one of the most beloved elements of the entire series. Field items and their simple beginnings. In the early stages of development, items found on the ground weren't marked by glowing effects or obvious indicators. They were simply placed on tiles, sometimes hidden, sometimes visible as small dots, sometimes suggested only through slight changes in the environment. This created a quiet sense of discovery, a feeling that the world held tiny secrets waiting to be uncovered by players who were curious enough to look closely. The developers enjoyed hiding treasures in plain sight, hoping players would learn to explore carefully, to appreciate the gentle details of each route. In many ways, this design choice helped create the signature Pokémon feeling, a world that rewards curiosity, not with flashy spectacle, but with quiet, meaningful moments. Environmental effects, gentle layers of atmosphere. Even before advanced weather systems existed, Generation 1 included subtle environmental cues that shaped the mood of different areas. Darker tiles in caves, different grass textures, soft shading effects, occasional palette shifts. These were early attempts to build atmosphere on a very small canvas. When combined with the Game Boy's limited sound channels, these visual choices created emotional landscapes, forests that felt calm, caves that felt heavy, and towers that felt lonely. These quiet touches were not technical feats. They were artistic ones. The developers wanted the world's feelings to shift as players traveled, just as real environments influence mood. The early blueprint for future weather systems. Although Generation 1's weather effects were primitive, they established the foundation for later systems. Future generations would expand these seeds into rain that boosts water-type moves, sunlight that activates solar beam, hail that chips away at HP, sandstorms that favor rock and ground types, fog that lowers accuracy. But at the heart of these mechanics was a simple idea born in Kanto. Nature should play a role in battle. The developers wanted the world to feel alive, not a static backdrop, but a place where forces beyond the player shaped each moment. It was a quiet, poetic vision, limited by hardware, but carried forward by imagination. These early experiments, weather tests, explosive damage quirks, subtle environmental cues, and the comforting atmosphere of Pokémon centers, all contributed to a world that felt tangible, warm, and full of personality. They weren't just features. They were the soft breaths of a world being born. And as we drift deeper into Pokémon's early development, we'll soon explore myths, rumors, and the cultural footprints left in Kanto's casinos, ships, and stories whispered among players in schoolyards. For now, let the quiet of these early mechanics settle gently around you, like fog rolling softly over a calm landscape. As players made their way through the Kanto region, they encountered places filled with rumors, myths, and bits of real-world culture woven quietly into the game's design. Some of these stories became playground legends, others reflected cultural inspirations directly, and a few were shaped by design decisions that weren't always obvious at first glance. Tonight, we drift into these stories, the mysteries surrounding the SS Anne truck, the controversies around Kanto's game corners, and the geography that mirrored real-world regions. These elements, though small, helped Pokémon feel like a world you could get lost in. The SS Anne truck, a rumor that defined a Generation 1 of the most famous myths in all of Pokémon's history, stemmed from a single, static truck sitting quietly near the SS Anne. Players discovered it because it appeared unreachable, a mysterious object that stood out in a world where most objects served a purpose. Naturally, this led to rumors, whispers in playgrounds, notes passed between classmates, and soon the story spread. There's a hidden Mew under the truck. Children tried everything, using strength, using cut, surfing around the docks, attempting glitches they half understood, even trying to push the truck with different Pokémon. Of course, the truck had no purpose. It wasn't meant to be seen at all. It was simply a decorative world-building element the developers forgot to hide properly after the boat left. But the myth became bigger than the truth. For an entire generation of players, the truck wasn't just an object. It was a symbol of mystery, a reminder that Pokémon held secrets, even if you didn't fully understand them. In a way, the truck represented the imagination of early players, something the developers never anticipated, but quietly cherished. The Game Corner, a reflection of real-world culture. The Celadon Game Corner was another surprising piece of the world, a bright, colorful casino environment tucked inside a children's game. Slot machines, flashing lights, prizes that felt rare and exciting. It all created an atmosphere unlike anything else in the region. But this wasn't random. At the time, Japan was filled with entertainment arcades and game parlors. Pachinko machines were everywhere, and the idea of mixing games with rewards was culturally common. So when the developers designed the Game Corner, they were reflecting a real-world environment familiar to Japanese players. However, outside of Japan, especially in Western countries, gambling in children's games raised concerns. Future Pokémon games slowly removed or altered these features, replacing slot machines with skill-based minigames, and eventually removing gambling entirely. But the Game Corner in Generation 1 remains a snapshot of the time, a little slice of 90s Japanese culture preserved inside a pixelated room. Regional names, inspired by the real world. While the Pokémon world felt fantastical and imaginative, its regions were grounded in real-world geography and emotional tone. Kanto was directly inspired by the Kanto region of Japan, Tokyo and its surrounding areas. Johto reflected Kansai, a region known for its rich traditions, temples, and cultural depth. Even the cities in the games borrow personality from their real-world counterparts. Large metropolitan centers, quiet rural towns, historic locations, ports facing the sea. This blending of real and imaginary geography helped Pokémon feel familiar. Even if you'd never heard of Tokyo or Osaka, players sensed that the world had weight, that it came from a real place, and that it felt grounded despite its fantasy. Rumors and the magic of childhood imagination. One of the unspoken qualities of early Pokémon games is how much of the world unfolded through rumor. Before the internet was common, players relied on schoolyard stories, magazines, whispers from older siblings, experimentation, and pure imagination. Rumors like, "There's a secret garden behind Bill's house. You can catch Yoshi in the game. There's a way to go to the moon. You can reach the top of the Pokémon Tower." None of these were true, but they made the world feel larger, as though anything could be hidden beyond the edges of the map. The developers didn't design these rumors, but the simplicity and mystery of the game's world, its quiet corners and unreachable places, created the perfect environment for them to thrive. These myths became a part of Pokémon's personality, shared generation to generation, remembered with nostalgia even today. The culture behind the SS. Anne. Even the SS Anne itself was inspired by the romantic idea of international cruise ships, floating cities filled with travelers, trainers, chefs, sailors, and stories. In Japan, cruise culture has always been linked to exploration and luxury. The SS Anne captured this feeling perfectly. Elegant rooms, curious passengers, trainers from faraway places, a sense of temporary adventure. It wasn't just a boat. It was a miniature world contained inside the larger one. When it left the harbor, it took that world with it, creating a sense of impermanence that made the experience feel special. And the abandoned truck nearby, that became the spark of endless imagination. These elements, the truck rumor, the game corner controversy, the regional inspirations, the floating elegance of the SS Anne, all contribute to the emotional texture of early Pokémon. They reveal how real-life culture, childhood imagination, and small design choices blended into a world that felt alive and mysterious. A world where every corner seemed to hide a story, even when the truth was simple. And in that simplicity, the magic grew. As Pokémon continued to evolve, the developers introduced deeper layers of hidden mechanics, systems that shaped the personality, strength, and individuality of each creature. These features weren't always visible to players, and many of them weren't even fully understood until years later. But quietly, behind the scenes, they helped define the soul of the Pokémon world. Tonight, we drift into those hidden systems, the birth of natures, the strange logic behind effort values, the early seeds of abilities, and the ideas that planted the foundation for double battles, and the gentle symbolism woven into baby Pokémon. These mechanics shaped how Pokémon grew, how they battled, and how they formed emotional connections with the player, even when the player didn't know these systems existed. Natures, giving Pokémon personality through numbers. The concept of natures didn't arrive until later generations, but the emotional intention behind them began early. Game Freak wanted Pokémon to feel individual, not identical copies of each other, but creatures with tiny quirks and preferences. Some bold, some timid, some playful, some serious. In the beginning, the team didn't have the hardware to express personality beyond a few basic stats, but the wish was there, a desire for each Pokémon to feel alive, as though the one you caught was truly yours. When natures eventually arrived, they quietly influenced how Pokémon grew, how they fought, how they adapted. But more importantly, they reinforced an emotional truth. Two Pokémon of the same species could still feel different, unique in small but meaningful ways. Even if players didn't always notice the math behind the scenes, the system added a sense of individuality that matched the spirit of the world. Effort values, a hidden story of growth. Before Pokémon had a polished system for training and stat improvement, Generation 1 relied on a hidden mechanic known today as effort values, or EVs. These values increased as your Pokémon battled different species. Though they happened silently in the background, they represented something the developers cared deeply about: growth through experience. With each battle, strength increased, endurance improved, speed sharpened, special abilities flourished. The game didn't show these changes explicitly. There were no pop-up messages, no stat screens explaining it. But beneath the surface, every battle told a story. A story of a Pokémon slowly becoming stronger, not because of numbers, but because it fought alongside you. EVs were the mathematical expression of a bond, a reflection of shared experiences accumulated over time. Abilities, the seeds of identity. Abilities, as we know them today, weren't part of Generation 1, but their conceptual roots existed in the early design philosophy. The developers wanted Pokémon to feel biologically grounded, behaviorally distinct, influenced by their environment, shaped by instincts. Even before official abilities existed, certain Pokémon already had unique passive features. Ghost types could slip past normal type moves. Ground types were unaffected by Thunder Wave. Certain Pokémon had immunities based on lore or logic. Some moves behaved differently depending on the user. These small details were the first quiet steps toward the idea that Pokémon could possess unique biological traits beyond moves and stats. When abilities finally debuted, they felt like a natural extension of a philosophy that had been whispering through the game since the beginning. Creatures are defined by more than what they do. They are defined by what they are. Double battles. An idea. Waiting for technology. Double battles wouldn't appear until Generation 3, but their earliest spark began during the Kanto era. The developers imagined a world where Pokémon could fight side by side, sharing the battlefield, interacting with each other, creating combinations of moves and strategies. But the Game Boy simply couldn't support multiple sprites in motion, shared animations, double damage calculations, simultaneous move interactions. The idea had to wait. Yet even in the earliest concept art and designer notes, you can see sketches of paired Pokémon, partners who fought together, not alone. The dream was there from the beginning. It simply needed time and stronger hardware to take shape. Baby Pokémon. The softest expression of connection. Baby Pokémon didn't appear in Generation 1, but the emotion they represent was already woven into the earliest design philosophy. The team wanted the world to feel full of families, life cycles, growth, innocence, gentle beginnings. Even the placement of the daycare hinted at a bigger idea. Pokémon weren't just tools for battle. They were living beings with their own sense of lineage. Baby Pokémon eventually became a symbol of nurture, patience, tenderness, and the quiet beauty of watching something small grow into something strong. When they finally arrived, they felt like missing puzzle pieces that had always belonged to the world. Their roots, emotionally, lived in Kanto's heart from day one. Quiet mechanics that shaped emotional design. All of these early concepts, natures, EVs, abilities, baby Pokémon, and even ideas like double battles, share something in common. They weren't just gameplay features, they were philosophical features. They reflected Pokémon's core identity, a world where growth is personal, where small differences matter, where creatures have souls, personalities, instincts, and histories, where battles aren't just numbers, but stories of partnership and progress. These systems, even before they fully existed, were part of the gentle, emotional fabric the developers were weaving. A fabric that made Pokémon more than a game. It made it a companion, a memory, a world that felt alive and meaningful. As we reach the end of this quiet journey through Pokémon's earliest secrets, take a moment to let your thoughts settle, to let the pace of the world around you slow down, and to simply breathe. We've wandered through Kanto's forgotten corners, gently brushing past stories tucked into old code, ideas that never fully bloomed, and memories that shaped the childhood of millions. We explored the creatures who never made it into the final roster, the experiments hidden deep inside the game's data, and the small pieces of human creativity that breathed life into this tiny, pixelated world. We traveled through Lavender Town's gentle sadness, the glowing warmth of Pokémon centers, the mysteries of Unknown, the spark of shinies waiting to be born, and the quiet brilliance behind early mechanics that helped a simple Game Boy game feel alive. Every detail, no matter how small, carried a piece of someone's imagination. Someone drawing late at night, someone experimenting with limited memory, someone dreaming of a world that children could explore and cherish. Pokémon was never just a game, it was a doorway, a soft place to land, a companion for the long walk through childhood. And even now, all these years later, these stories remind us why Kanto still feels warm and familiar, why those old sprites still feel alive, why those melodies still echo softly in the back of our minds. So as this video comes to an end, you don't need to rush back into anything. You can let your thoughts drift a little longer. Let the nostalgia settle like dust on an old cartridge. Let your breathing soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. And if you're already falling asleep, that's perfectly okay. You're safe here. You're resting. You're exactly where you're meant to be. Thank you for spending this time exploring the quiet, forgotten history of Pokémon. When you're ready, whether that's tomorrow, next week, or whenever you return, there will always be more stories waiting for you. For now, rest well, dream gently, and good night.